Reading a bit today about the Beachy Head woman, um, who is apparently the first ever black Briton, or one of the first. She lived in England from about 250 to 350, well, in that bracket anyway. She died at about 30 years of age. People have looked at the shape of her skull and her face and did measurements and checked out the dimensions and whatever, and came to the conclusion that this lady was of sub-Saharan origin. A subsequent analysis of her skeleton, the osteoarchaeologists, I believe they took DNA, I'm not too sure, but they surmised that she lived her entire life in England. She was born there and lived all her life there. But from the shape of her skull or whatever, they think that she was of sub-Saharan origin. Well, we're all of African origin, but of course they mean recent. They extrapolated this to, from her being a sub-Saharan to being black, which is a fair assumption. And then from that there were black communities and whatnot at this time in British history. Now, I have never heard of black people in England thousands of years ago, anything like that. There was black people in England from the 1950s onwards in any great numbers. I'm aware of the book Black Tudors. I read it. Yes, there was a scattering of black people in England before the 1950s, but they were not in Britain in any numbers to speak of really before the 1950s. If you see videos of London, people being interviewed in the street in London in the 1960s, for example, everyone is white. It's completely ethnically homogenous. You don't see anybody in the picture who is white, and there's people coming and going left, right and centre. So the idea that there was black communities in England thousands of years ago seems ridiculous to me, but I haven't got a doctorate in this area of study. There's people that know a lot more about this than I do. But in my study of English history and British history, I've never come across mention of black people, not that far back, nothing close to it. I think if the Romans, they were fairly studious in their record keeping, and surely they would have mentioned black people being in Britain. There would have been some mention of them somewhere or whatever, but I'm not sure there was. I don't think there was. If there's anybody out there with any more information on this skeleton, if there was DNA taken, I can't find much on Wikipedia, and the people that I do find making videos on it are the kind of people that I suspect may have an agenda in this regard, So to take the dimensions of a skull, it stinks of pseudoscience to me, but I'm not a phrenologist. I don't really know enough about it to have a solid opinion, but it seems analogous to Germans measuring the size of noses in the 1930s to see who was Jewish or not. It's the same kind of... It cannot be an exact science. They cannot just measure the shape of a skull and then extrapolate from that yes, there's been black communities in Britain for thousands of years. That's absolutely absurd. That is not scholarship. It's not how science is done. But anthropology in particular, archaeology more and more, sociology, anthropology is just the worst. They are really, really, really left-wing. It's the most progressive discipline out there. So you can guess what these people want to be true, and how many of them will actually do the science properly. I really don't know, but I suspect the kind of people that I'm watching videos on around Beachy Head Woman. I suspect their motives. But look, I could be wrong on this. I absolutely could be wrong, but I don't know why they don't take the DNA and find out if it was a black person or a white person. Black people have no Neanderthal DNA, whereas white people do. It would be pretty simple, presumably, to do a test like that. It seems to be very much like the Viking warrior, the supposed female Viking warrior, who was found in a Viking warrior grave. The skeleton was always assumed to belong to a man, but on recent closer analysis, they found out it was a woman. So rather than wait for more evidence or whatever, or assume that a warrior wanted to be buried with his woman, they said, oh no, the women must have been warriors along with the men, and crafted a whole narrative around this, that the show Vikings was actually true. That's the way it was. There was females hacking apart 250-pound medieval men on the battlefield, and that's the way it was. Anyone with a working brain can see that for what it is. But that's what they do. They find a single example of something and run with it, craft a whole narrative, and the people at Wikipedia, I don't know what is wrong with these people, because they have the whole thing up. They have this female Viking warrior and a whole page on it, and the same with Beachy Head Woman. This is not scholarship, and it's certainly not science. And I really don't know why they just can't do a DNA test to see if this person was black or white or whatever. And there's a sleight of hand that's used around this topic. There is a well-known African garrison on Hadrian's Wall in the 2nd century, I think, or 3rd century. And when they use that word African, everybody automatically thinks black. But not everybody in Africa is black, obviously. And if we're talking about the Roman Empire did not stretch to sub-Saharan Africa. But they use this word knowing the image that will come into people's heads. So it's a sleight of hand, and it's disingenuous at best. The people were very likely to be white, as the area that they were from was on the Mediterranean coast, and the Romans ruled all of part of North Africa, Carthage, around there. And if they weren't white, they were Berber or Phoenician. They certainly were not black. But they go from an African garrison there proves that this is where the first black community was. This is how they work. This is how dishonest people craft a narrative. And let's face it, most people are not interested or have the time really to scratch under the surface and do a bit of digging and looking around to try and figure this stuff out. That's why I really appreciate History Debunked, Simon Webb. He's very good at this stuff, and he has the time, undoubtedly, to debunk a lot of this nonsense, to scratch under the surface where a lot of us don't. And I really appreciate that. But if there's anybody who has more information on Beachy Head Woman, because as I say, I might be wrong about this, but any more information would be much appreciated. Adios.